Every day, U.S. politicians emphasize the need for America to decouple from China and bring manufacturing back to the United States. Yet, when we examine the data, something surprising is happening behind the scenes. Some of the biggest and most influential American companies are not only maintaining their manufacturing presence in China, but are actually deepening their investments. They are sourcing more components from China and strengthening ties with the nation. As the world braces for a potential second Donald Trump presidency this coming January, all eyes will be on the White House. Trump will face the challenge of managing the complex U.S.-China relationship. Throughout his re-election campaign, Trump vowed to be tough on China, promising to impose tariffs on all Chinese imports. But can this strategy truly succeed? Can Donald Trump and his administration use sanctions and tariffs to bring back manufacturing jobs to the U.S.? While this approach appeals to Republican voters who believe in Trump's promise to make America great again, the reality is that moving these jobs back is nearly impossible. In today's video, we'll break down the three main reasons why, no matter what Trump does in office, China will remain a dominant driver of economic growth for most nations worldwide, including the United States. This episode is going to be insightful and engaging. Let's dive in. Let's begin by laying some groundwork. Take a look at the sheer scale of trade between the US and China. This chart illustrates the trade balance between the two nations over the past 25 years. Over the last decade, US trade with China has been steadily increasing almost every single year. Now let's go deeper and analyze the total value of monthly imports and exports between the two countries over the last 2 years. The data reveals remarkable consistency. Despite all the rhetoric from Washington, D.C., trade between the U.S. and China has remained largely unaffected. It's business as usual. The sheer volume of trade between the United States and China is staggering. Take a look at this chart that shows the trade balance between the two countries over the past quarter century. You'll notice that over the last decade, the United States has been sharply increasing its trade with China almost every single year. The total value of monthly imports and exports between the United States and China over the past 24 months is increasing remarkably fast with consistency. There has been no significant decrease in trade despite all the rhetoric coming from Washington, D.C. To understand why this is happening, we need to step outside the mainstream media narrative, which often paints China in a negative light. Take, for instance, this white paper from the American Chamber of Commerce in China. It offers a revealing insight into the mindset of U.S. companies. Over 90% of participating firms identified China as a top investment destination, and 75% plan to reinvest in the country. This trend is happening because China is leading the charge in developing the technologies that will shape our world's future. Don't just take my word for it. Consider this report from the Financial Times. It says EU to demand technology transfers from Chinese companies. This highlights the EU's efforts to secure technology transfers from Chinese companies. This phenomenal shift is happening right now because China is inventing the technology that will control the future of our world. For decades, China's strategy involved acquiring technology from the West. Now, the roles have reversed. Western nations are figuring out how to access cutting-edge Chinese technology. A common misconception about China is that foreign companies move there for cheap labor. But this isn't true. Apple CEO Tim Cook clarifies this misunderstanding, saying, "The popular belief is that companies come to China for low labor costs. But the reality is that China hasn't been a low labor cost country for years. Companies come for the sheer concentration of skilled talent and advanced infrastructure. China stopped being the low labor cost country many years ago. The reason companies come to China is because of the quantity of skill in one location. If you want to hire engineers in the United States, you will struggle to fill a single classroom. But in China, you can fill a football stadium in no time." Tim Cook's statement underscores an important truth. Low labor costs are irrelevant if a country doesn't have the skilled workforce or infrastructure to support manufacturing. If cheap labor were the main factor, we'd see a flood of foreign companies moving to India. But despite India's low labor costs, it lacks the skilled workforce and infrastructure to compete with China. However, there's an even bigger reason why China will continue to dominate global manufacturing: its leadership in clean energy. The future of manufacturing is shifting toward green energy, solar panels, wind turbines, and electric vehicles. In this space, China is not just a player but a global powerhouse. While we're talking about China, it's important to know that they're central to the story of rare earths and anxiety over supply. China controls by far the biggest share of the world's rare earth reserves, but there is also a high concentration of them in Vietnam. Brazil and Russia also control a substantial amount. However, when it comes to actually refining and processing, China is even further ahead. Controlling most of the global trade in rare earths gives China enormous strategic power, and that's something Beijing is fully aware of. The International Energy Agency predicts that demand for rare earths driven by clean energy technology will rise more than threefold by 2040 in what they call the stated policy scenario, and sevenfold in the sustainable development scenario. That's where all current pledges to emit net zero emissions are reached. In a statement, the agency's executive director Fatih Birol said, "Today, the data shows a looming mismatch between the world's strengthened climate ambitions and the availability of critical minerals that are essential to realizing those ambitions." In 2022, the U.S. Geological Survey published a list of 50 mineral commodities critical to the U.S. economy and national security, and China is the primary source of 26 of the 50 minerals. These critical raw materials are used in a variety of sectors, including energy production, communication technology, transportation, and national defense, and are essential for everything from mobile phones and computer hard drives to batteries for electric vehicles, as well as precision-guided missiles and high-tech ammunition. As a consequence, U.S. companies are heavily reliant on Chinese companies to source component parts and manufacture products more cost-effectively. Boeing has stated China has a component role on every current Boeing commercial airplane model, the 737, 747, 767, 777, and 787 Dreamliner, and that more than 10,000 Boeing airplanes currently fly throughout the world with parts and assemblies built in China. Apple has been relocating factories into Southeast Asia and India, but still relies on several Chinese-made components in its products, such as acoustics, glass, connectors, and display panels. Apple also assembles the majority of iPhones, iPads, and MacBooks and other accessories in China, in Shenzhen, Chengdu, and Zhengzhou, through its contract manufacturing partner, Foxconn. And, while Tesla manufactures its vehicles for the U.S. market in the U.S., 40% of Tesla's EV battery suppliers are Chinese companies. Ellison of East West drilled down on the economic realities of the supply chain trickling back to China, elaborating that they had 2 plant closures in North Carolina in 2024, which were a direct result of the 25% tariffs imposed by President Trump in his first term. He shared, "We were one of the largest electronics assemblers east of the Mississippi, and many of the components have to come from Asia. There is no domestic source, so when faced with already higher labor costs in the U.S., combined with the rising cost of important component parts due to the tariffs, we had to move most of those assemblies to Costa Rica and Mexico." China's control over these technologies isn't just substantial, it's transformative. Research shows that China holds an overwhelming advantage in rare earth minerals, which are essential for the green energy transition. Former Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping famously said, "The Middle East has oil, and China has rare earths." He was absolutely right. While rare earth reserves are scattered across the globe, 40% are located in China. Moreover, China accounts for over 70% of rare earth mining and nearly 90% of the processing. This dominance isn't limited to resources. China is also leading in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education. Chinese universities consistently rank among the top in fields like mining, metallurgy, and chemical engineering, producing a vast pool of talent. Apple's Tim Cook highlights why this matters. "The tools and precision required for our products demand advanced engineering expertise. In the US, you'd struggle to gather a room of tooling engineers. In China, you could fill multiple stadiums. This expertise is a key reason why companies like Apple continue to invest in China, despite political tensions. While US politicians frame China as a threat, the truth is that China has significantly contributed to US economic growth over the last 50 years. A recent New York Times article titled, "Breaking Up with China is Hard to Do," sheds light on why tariffs and political pressure haven't deterred U.S. companies from relying on China. Instead, these policies have primarily hurt American consumers, who bear the brunt of increased costs. Ford Motor Company's recent pivot illustrates this dynamic perfectly. Unable to compete with China's advanced electric vehicle industry, Ford has decided to license battery technology from CATL, a Chinese company, while seeking U.S. government subsidies to produce batteries domestically. Meanwhile, Apple is strengthening its presence in China by increasing its reliance on Chinese suppliers and expanding its research facilities. Despite political tensions, smart American companies recognize that the future lies in Asia. And so, with such a clear rationale and demonstrable efforts to decouple from China, why can't we just break up already? Understanding why China has a chokehold on the U.S. and many multinational companies has a lot to do with the government's creation of special economic zones, SEZs, in the 1980s that were designed to attract foreign investment, spur innovation, and accelerate industrial growth. The first SEZs were considered experiments because previously China was a closed economy where the government controlled almost all aspects of production, prices, and resource allocation, effectively isolating itself from the global market and limiting private enterprise and foreign trade. For example, the city of Shenzhen was once a small fishing village of 30,000 before it was designated as one of the first SEZs in 1980. Now, Shenzhen, which was ranked as a top 10 global finance center in 2024, is home to multinational tech companies like Huawei and Tencent, maker of WeChat, and in 2023 was listed by Forbes as one of the top 10 cities with the most billionaires, is considered by some to be China's Silicon Valley. The Shenzhen experiment illustrates what happens when you bring together dense clusters of suppliers, logistical infrastructure including highways, railroads and ports, skilled workers, economic investment, and tax incentives. In fact, it has been estimated by the World Economic Forum that 90% of the world's electronics are made in Shenzhen, including mobile phones, televisions, air conditioning units, and drones. China's dominance extends beyond talent and resources to infrastructure. Its ports, high-speed rail networks, and Belt and Road Initiative ensure efficient global trade. With so much fragmentation of the global supply chain, it begs the question, what can and should be manufactured and assembled right here in the USA at competitive prices? Farrell emphasized that there is opportunity in the machining and fabrication industry, explaining that there are actually 200,000 component parts of a locomotive, but there is a huge shortage of skilled labor because technical trades like welding, for example, are no longer taught in high school as a vocation. Both Ellison and Farrell agree that there are certain products that can be prioritized for U.S. manufacturing, such as complex or new technology that requires a lot of precision, validation, and hands-on, high-touch support and expertise. It's an important step in the right direction that the Biden administration did pass 3 massive pieces of legislation funneling trillions of dollars and/or tax incentives toward U.S. innovation and industrial productivity that have ultimately fueled a manufacturing renaissance across the U.S. Since 2021, over $2.1 trillion has been allocated by the government to pro-manufacturing initiatives through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, and the CHIPS Act. And according to BlackRock, as of November 2023, the private sector has pledged an additional $614 billion towards the production of semiconductors, electric vehicles, and batteries. But it will require much more capital and investment to build up the U.S. manufacturing ecosystem similar to the SEZ model in China, and it may take decades to develop. In the meantime, made in China, whether directly or indirectly, is the sobering reality that we face. In conclusion, the idea of decoupling from China is more rhetoric than reality. Tariffs and political pressure won't change the fundamental economic advantages that China holds. For the U.S. to bring manufacturing back, it needs to invest in workforce development, infrastructure, and supply chains, an approach we've yet to see. If you found this video insightful, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join our growing community. Stay informed on the critical global events shaping our future. And for a deeper dive, don't miss my video on how the energy crisis and the United States played a key role in destroying the German economy. Click here to watch. It's a story you won't want to miss.